So in part one of our conversation together, we talked quite a bit about your role as the interpreter, the conductor, the interpreter of Messiah. And we also talked quite a bit about some of your most memorable performances of Messiah. I know that you've been doing a lot of thinking and reflecting on exactly what Messiah means, however, and why it's such a significant work to you.
Yes, well, I think I said that it was relatively recently that I realized that the text is definitely ambiguous. I mean, it's taken from writings that were some 500 years, 700 years before the birth of Jesus Christ, and as we said, the plan is the first part is mostly the prophecies of Christ's coming, suffering, and death, redemption of mankind. Those are the three ways. But what Charles Jennens, who was the librettist, has done, he put together mostly Old Testament verses that crucially find echoes in the New Testament. So in other words, he's picked out the stuff that St. Matthew, for instance, and St. Paul in the New Testament have reworked and made them into prophecies. But who were these prophets, and what were they prophesying? I mean, our modern perception of a prophet is somebody who foretells and predicts the future. But this is not what they were doing. The Old Testament prophets weren't prophesying 7 centuries ahead. There's a very interesting book written by Mary Ellen Chase, who's a writer about a religious writer, and I'll just read it to you because it's quite interesting what she says. The prophets, that is, they belong to their own day, and their hopes for peace and order in their own world had to do with their world and not far distant futures of which they know nothing. So as we'll see that the prophecies that they are foretelling the future, but the very near future, in other words, and we will see that. I will illustrate that point in a minute. So, but the construction of the work makes the listener think they are hearing prophecies directly connected to Jesus Christ. That's the point. Another writer, Ruth Smith, says the Old Testament prophecies were seen to be fulfilled in the New Testament. But we will see that they are describing events. They're describing events at the time that they were written, rather than 7 centuries.
Do you think that Charles Jennens would have been aware of that?
Well, I'm sure he was, actually, and I'm sure his choices of verses were always echoed by New Testament writers. Maybe not in every single case, but the fact that he's picked on the prophecies that seemed to be picked up by the New Testament writers. Let's look at the first one, "Comfort ye my people."
Saith our God, saith
The story of this is that in 587 BC, the Babylonians captured Jerusalem and destroyed Solomon's temple. The exiled inhabitants were taken to Babylon, and Isaiah wrote about their longing to be back in Jerusalem. And through him, God is saying they will be home soon. So, comfort ye my people. God is speaking comfortably, speak ye comfortably, comfortingly, if you like. War is accomplished. War is over. So it's all there in the text. And then every valley shall be exalted. This is the most fascinating one. Because, you know, I always heard every valley shall be exalted. And I used to hear Welsh tenors sing this, thinking there was something to do with Wales. And, you know, every valley, you know, shall be exalted. And I thought there was something to do with the Welsh valleys. Anyway, this was when I was very small. But you will see from the map, and we're going to show you a map of the journey the Jews took in exile. They went round the desert from Jerusalem to Babylon. And you would imagine when they were coming home, they would take the same route back. But because it was such a long way, they would take a shortcut, and God would make this possible. They would be led through the desert where every valley shall be exalted. In other words, the dips in the desert would be filled in. Mountains would be made low. They'd be flattened. The winding paths would be straightened. And then the rough surfaces, plain, evened out. So the rough place is plain. So, you know, it's there in detail. And this is all about their journey home, coming back from Babylon.
Like they're actually describing the geography.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And Handel put a real spring in their step in this "Every Valley Shall Be Exalted." It's such an exuberant air. It's such a wonderful piece.
Shall be exalted.
does knowing that, does that inform the way you might coach a tenor to sing that?
Not really. Not really. I have to say that it doesn't, it makes me as a listener, it gives it another dimension. Interesting that you said when you're coaching a tenor, I do say to the tenor, you know what this is about, don't you? And they variously say yes, and they don't. They don't know that this is about the return of the exiles from Babylon. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't mean they're not going to sing it right. But it's just something that I feel we all should know. We all should know that it's such an ingenious way of putting a text together, for one thing.
And I think just in terms of it speaks to the importance of audience reception, because if you are aware of this, if those Old Testament texts speak to you in that way, then you experience it completely differently as a listener than you would if you were not aware of that.
I think you're right. I think you're right. So let's look at Behold, a Virgin Shall Conceive. This is just a short recitative.
Shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us.
So this is fascinating because this seems to be a direct reference to Christ's birth. So the Virgin in this context is actually describing merely a young woman through the translation from Hebrew to Greek. I don't need to go into that any further, but this was just a young woman. And the story here involves a complicated political situation where the king of Judah was being pressured by an alliance of neighboring states against the king of Assyria. And Isaiah's words represent an assurance from God that the king of Judah would be safe from the threats of his neighbors. And the sign was that a young woman in the New Testament, St. Matthew turned this into virgin, would become pregnant. And within 9 months, there would be no more threat. The child would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Amazing that this complex situation is reduced to one line of recitative. It took me 6 times as long to tell the story than it is to sing the one recitative. But I think the alto who sings that should know that that's what all this is about. It was looking into the future, 9 months into the future, not 500 years.
In referencing a complex geopolitical situation.
Exactly. And of course, St. Matthew picked this up and said, look at this. This is what they said. So it must be a prophecy. And of course, prophecy is hindsight. So that's how you can explain it.
That's fascinating.
It is, isn't it?
Yes.
In part 2, let's look at all they that see him shall laugh him to scorn. So this is accompanied recitative sung by the tenor, comes after He was despised. This comes from the book of Psalms, and the writer or psalmist is being persecuted, and it's not clear what the danger is. So interesting to see what the previous verse from this is. It goes like this. But I am a worm and no man, a reproach of men and despised of the people. You wouldn't put that in Messiah, but cleverly, the New Testament writers and Charles Jennens picked out the relevant one that said, all they that see him shall laugh him to scorn. Obviously, this is a reference to Jesus on his way to being crucified. So what Jennens does, Jennens alters the verses quoted here from the first person to the third person. So it's he. And, you know, as you heard, Handel brilliantly encapsulates the scornful laughter of those watching Jesus's journey to his crucifixion. And that's followed immediately by he trusted in God. Mm. So the original text is here, is in the Psalms, commit thyself unto the Lord, let him deliver him, seeing he delighteth in him. So Jennens turns this into a braying crowd, where Jesus is being tormented and ridiculed on the cross. Let him deliver him becomes a taunt to see if he really can be saved. And of course, you know, the way I do this, which you will hear, is very, very aggressively, but also very ironically and very sarcastically.
He trusted in God that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, if he delights in him. He trusted in God that he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, if he delights in him. He trusted in God he would deliver him. Let him deliver him, if he delights in him. He trusted in God that he would deliver him. Let him
But it's brilliant to see the transformation of these verses adapted to tell another story in such a powerful way.
So I think one of the things that this whole conversation has made me think of in a way is why particular works of art are so enduring. And the fact that Messiah is so popular is one of the things that I've thought about a lot, actually. And going back to, you know, the very early performances of Messiah, where Handel's reworking, and right away it's a popular thing, into the 19th century, where there are the Amateur Choral Society performances started proliferating and still continue to this day. And then all of the various professional performances and the way that's evolved over time. I think that it really speaks to just how much meaning is contained in this single work. And I think that our conversation has really brought this to light for me. The way it speaks to me as a lover of Handel, I think that the music is just great. I love listening to the way Handel dramatizes the various moments and brings them to life. Someone who's familiar with the Old Testament text actually might have a very different interpretation of the way the music and text interact and walk away with a very different feeling. And then you as a conductor with your intimate inside experience of the work, it just shows that perhaps one of the reasons Messiah is so great and has perpetuated so long over time is because there's just simply so much in it. It has so much to say.
I think you're right. And I think it also can appeal to somebody who has no religious beliefs at all, mm-hmm. and who has no religious knowledge, because this can be about, this is so human. It's about humanity. It's about a human being. Always, it's always about a human being that we're talking about, and it can be anybody that is being persecuted, that is born into this extraordinary world of either the beginning of Christianity, or we're talking about a world that is from, you know, the Babylonian exiles. So, but it also can appeal to, you know, people who don't have any of this knowledge. And I think, and of course, what people will tell me is, oh, let's talk about this so much, just let's listen to the music. And of course, you know, you're absolutely right, let's just listen to the music. But if it just happens that, you know, one little extra bit of knowledge about the depth of this text can enhance your enjoyment, then it's worth it.
Absolutely. And I hope that, I know I've loved talking to you, and I know it's going to enhance my enjoyment of our performances, and hopefully the other people listening to our conversation will walk away with the same feeling. So
Good.
Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Thank you too. I can't wait to be there with you all again.
Me too. Thanks, Nicholas.
Bye.
Bye.